The dawn, over Kabul, broke as if time itself had paused. On the snow-dusted peaks of the Hindu Kush, the first rays of the sun bled across the horizon like molten gold. Yet down in the valley below, a different kind of power was making its presence. Known it was the autumn of 1839, and the pride of the British Empire. The army of the Indus was marching into the heart of Afghanistan. Their arrival was an alien symphony of sound, the thunder of drums, the brassy cry of trumpets, and the skirl of bagpipes echoing through passes that had only ever known the whisper of the wind. Their standards, the bold Union Jack, sliced through the thin mountain air, carried with a certainty that suggested they were not merely an army, but an instrument of destiny. This was a moving city of 4,500 British and Indian soldiers and more than 12,000 camp followers, a sprawling mass of servants, cooks, wives, and children. It did not feel like an invasion. It felt like a coronation procession, a victory parade before the war had even been fought. On their faces was not the grit of battle, but the gloss of arrogance, the unshakable belief that they had conquered this wild land without firing a single meaningful shot. Major General William Elphinstone, an aging, gout-ridden nobleman whose command owed more to his social connections than his military acumen, surveyed the scene from his horse. For him, this was the crowning moment of a long, unremarkable career. "We are bringing civilization to this savage frontier," he might have thought, his mind already on the peerage he hoped this triumph would secure. Around him, younger officers like Captain George Lawrence and Lieutenant Vincent Eyre were intoxicated by the romance of the great game. To them, Afghanistan was a grand adventure, a theater for glory and promotion. They had heard tales of Kabul's exotic bazaars and veiled women, and they saw the land not for what it was, but for what it could give them. They were blind to the truth of the terrain they crossed, oblivious to the fact that the silent mountains surrounding them were alive with eyes. Behind every rock, it seemed, was a shadow. In every shadow, a watcher. The people of Kabul emerged from their homes and shops to witness the spectacle. Their faces unreadable masks of quiet observation. There was no welcome, but no open hostility either, only a deep, unnerving stillness. They had seen invaders before, from Alexander to Genghis Khan. These new men, with their red coats and loud music, were just another chapter in a very old story. The British established their cantonment, not within the secure, towering walls of the Bala Hissa fortress, but on a low, indefensible plain beside the Kabul River. It was a catastrophic error, a decision born of pure hubris. The cantonment was surrounded by hills, orchards, and walled gardens, a sniper's paradise. But at that moment, such threats were inconceivable. To them, this patch of land was a little piece of England transplanted into the Afghan wilderness. They had brought with them their cricket bats, their polo sticks, their crates of French wine and English porcelain. They believed the war was over. They believed they were here to stay. But this confidence, this unearned and brittle pride, was their greatest vulnerability. They had not come to win the land, only to occupy it. And the history of Afghanistan is a testament to a simple, brutal fact. The land is easy to take, but impossible to hold. As the last British soldier marched into the cantonment, a lone eagle circled high overhead, its shadow gliding silently over the disciplined columns. It watched them, a predator observing a strange new herd that had wandered into its domain. The British celebrated their bloodless victory, but a chill lingered in the Kabul air. A silence that was not peace, but the deep breath before the storm. They had conquered the ground beneath their feet, but not the souls of the people who lived on it, and the same mountains that had watched their arrival in silence would soon become their tomb. Their confidence was a palace of glass, magnificent to behold, but fragile. The first cracks in that palace appeared the very moment they set foot on Kabul's soil, long before they ever heard the sound of a hostile rifle. From those silent, watching mountains, the real power in this land was taking measure of the new arrivals. Their patience as ancient and unyielding as the rock itself. Here is the next section of the script, flowing directly from the end of the previous one. The eagle that circled over the British cantonment was not the only one watching. High in the jagged peaks that ringed the Kabul valley, where the air was thin and cold, men of a different feather gathered. They were the chieftains of the Ghilzai, the Durrani, the Kohistani, the true masters of this realm, wrapped in heavy wool patis, their faces weathered by a lifetime of sun and wind. They looked down upon the invaders' camp, not with fear, but with a cold, calculating curiosity. Their observation was a silent, patient art, honed over centuries, of resisting empires that had come and gone. From the rocky promontories of the Siasung Hills, they could see it all: the neat rows of tents, the glint of bayonets in the sun, the absurd spectacle of red-coated soldiers playing cricket on a patch of flattened earth. To them, it was a theatre of the bizarre. The British had brought their world with them, sealing themselves inside a bubble of false familiarity, utterly oblivious to the ancient, unwritten laws of the land they now occupied. Among these watchers was a man whose name would soon be etched in British nightmares: Wazir Akbar Khan, the favorite son of the deposed emir, Dost Muhammad Khan. He was not yet the leader of the resistance, but his heart burned with a cold fire. He saw the British flags flying over his city, and felt the sting of personal and national humiliation. He watched the British officers riding with an air of ownership, their laughter echoing in the same streets where his father had once commanded absolute respect. For Akbar Khan, this was not a political game. It was a blood feud. He studied their routines, their defenses, their arrogance. He noted how the cantonment was poorly sited, a death trap waiting to be sprung. He saw the supply lines stretching precariously back towards India, a fragile thread that could be cut with a single well-aimed strike. He listened to the whispers carried on the wind from the city tales of British soldiers disrespecting local customs, of their gold corrupting the weak, of their presence becoming an open wound on the honor of the Afghan people. He knew that patience was his sharpest weapon. The British were strong, but their strength was rigid, like a sword that could be broken. The Afghan strength was like water: it could yield, flow, and then, when the time was right, it could rise as a flood and wash everything away. The leaders did not need to conspire in grand councils. Their communication was more subtle, a shared understanding that flowed between the tribes. A messenger on a swift horse carrying a cryptic word, a shared glance at a market, a story told around a fire. These were the threads of their growing resistance. They saw Shah Shujah, the British puppet king, installed in the Bala Hissa, and they felt nothing but contempt. He was a ghost from the past, a king who ruled from behind a wall of foreign bayonets. He had no authority in the mountains, no power. In the valleys, where the real heart of Afghanistan beat, the British believed they were propping up a monarchy. The Afghan chiefs knew they were merely guarding a corpse. This quiet observation was a form of warfare in itself. It was an intelligence-gathering operation on a national scale, conducted not with spies and codes, but with the innate instincts of a people who knew every pass, every ravine, every hidden trail in their homeland. They were letting the British settle in, grow comfortable, and lower their guard. They were allowing the invaders' arrogance to ripen, knowing that pride is the heaviest burden to carry in a war, and that it would eventually drag them down into the snow and mud. As winter began to dust the highest peaks with the first snows, the watching intensified. The British saw the snow as a picturesque inconvenience, a backdrop for their winter balls and skating parties. The Afghan leaders saw it as an ally. They knew what the cold could do. They knew how it could sap the strength of an army, how it could turn a retreat into a massacre. The mountains were not just a vantage point. They were a weapon, and winter was the hand that would wield it. The British had brought their music and their flags, confident in the power of their empire. But up in the silent heights, the Afghan chiefs listened to a different music, the howl of the wind through the passes, a song that promised a reckoning. The British had arrived, but they had not yet been welcomed. And in this land, a welcome that is not given freely is a warning of the grave that is being dug. The quiet observation was over. The time for whispers was beginning. ****. The throne of Afghanistan was not won. It was delivered, like a piece of furniture. Inside the formidable walls of the Bala Hissar, the ancient citadel of kings, a hollow ceremony unfolded. Shah Shujah Durrani, a man who had spent decades in exile dreaming of this very moment, was once again declared the Emir of Afghanistan. The air in the grand hall was thick with the scent of incense, and the heavier, unspoken scent of betrayal. British officers in their immaculate dress uniforms stood as a guard of honor, their polished boots echoing on the marble floors. They were the true architects of this day, the puppeteers standing in plain sight. Sir William Hay Macnaghten, the chief political envoy of the British government, watched with an expression of supreme satisfaction. For him, this was the culmination of the great game, a masterful checkmate against Russian influence. He saw Shah Shujah not as a man, but as a policia-friendly buffer state secured, a triumph of diplomacy backed by just the right amount of force. He believed he was restoring a rightful king, but in the eyes of the Afghan people, he was desecrating. A throne Shah Shujah himself was a figure of tragic dissonance. He wore the lavish robes of an Afghan king, the jewels, the turban, but they hung on him like a costume. He was an old man now, his face a mask of weary ambition. As he sat on the throne, he tried to project an aura of command. But his eyes kept darting towards the British officers, seeking their approval, their reassurance. He was a king in his own palace, yet a guest in his own kingdom. He spoke of unity, of a new era of peace and prosperity under his reign. But his words were empty, carried away by the drafts in the cavernous hall. The few Afghan nobles who had been coerced or bribed into attending offered their congratulations with downcast eyes and forced smiles. They knew the truth. The power did not reside with the man on the throne, but with the white-faced foreigners who stood beside it. The real crown was not the jeweled turban on Shah Shujah's head, but the invisible weight of the British Empire that now pressed down upon all of Afghanistan. Outside the fortress walls, the city of Kabul received the news with a collective, contemptuous shrug. To the merchants in the bazaar, the artisans in their workshops, and the mullahs in the mosques, Shah Shujah was a foreigner himself, a man who had lived so long among the British in India that he had forgotten the ways of his own people. He was the Ferengis' king, not theirs. They called him Shah Shujahul Mulk, but often whispered it with a bitter twist, mocking his powerlessness. The British had assumed that by restoring a Durrani to the throne, they would win the loyalty of the Durrani tribes. They failed to understand that in Afghanistan, loyalty is not a matter of bloodline alone. It is earned through strength, honor, and respect for the traditions of Islam. Shah Shujah, propped up by infidel soldiers, possessed none of these here. He was a symbol not of restoration, but of occupation. Every decree he signed was seen as an order from Macnaghten. Every tax he levied was seen as tribute to a foreign power. The British, in their political naivety, saw the ceremony as a success. They had their man on the throne. The official dispatches sent back to Calcutta and London would speak of a smooth transition, of a grateful populace welcoming their rightful ruler. They mistook silence for acceptance and obedience for loyalty. They failed to see that by installing a puppet, they had not created a stable government. They had created a vacuum. They had removed Dost Muhammad Khan, a ruler who, for all his faults, was a leader of his own people. In his place, they had installed a void, and into that void, all the resentment, all the fury, and all the tribal ambitions of Afghanistan began to flow. Shah Shujah sat in his gilded cage, hosting lavish banquets that no one of importance wished to attend, while the real power dynamics of the country shifted in the mountains and the mosques. He was a king of a single fortress, the ruler of a cantonment's shadow. The British had given him a crown, but in doing so, they had made him the loneliest man in all of Afghanistan. A sovereign who reigned over nothing but his own impending doom. The throne was not a seat of power, it was a target. And the men in the mountains were already taking aim. The first winter in Kabul was not a season of war, but a season of delusion. While the Afghan chiefs watched from the frozen heights and the city simmered with a quiet rage. The British cantonment transformed itself into a bizarre and glittering imitation of English high society. It was a world hermetically sealed against the reality that lay just beyond its mud-brick walls. The air, which should have been tense with the awareness of being a foreign army in a hostile land, was instead filled with the sounds of laughter, the clinking of wine glasses, and the strains of a military band playing what the officers and their wives, having arrived with the camp followers, were determined to defeat the harshness of Afghanistan, not with weapons, but with relentless festivity. They had brought their entire world with them, and they were deaf too. The one they had invaded, Lady Florentia Sale, the formidable wife of General Fighting Bob Sale, became the unofficial queen of this transplanted society. Her diary, which would later become a famous chronicle of the disaster, was at this time filled with notes on dinner parties, amateur theatricals, and the latest gossip. She and the other ladies organized horse races on a makeshift track, the pounding of hooves a strange counterpoint to the silent, watchful mountains that served as a backdrop. They held balls where young officers, flushed with wine and vanity, would dance with the wives and daughters of their comrades, spinning under chandeliers in rooms that felt a universe away from the Medanstone reality of Kabul. They were performing their civilization, acting out a play of superiority for an audience that was not there. The real audience, the Afghan people, were outside, and they were not applauding. This relentless pursuit of pleasure was more than just a pastime. It was a symptom of a profound and fatal arrogance. The British saw themselves not as occupiers, but as rulers by divine right. They believed their cultural superiority was self-evident. They dismissed the Afghans as savages, treacherous and childlike, incapable of organized resistance. In their letters home, officers wrote with condescending amusement about the local customs, utterly failing to grasp the deep codes of honor, religion, and tribal loyalty that governed Afghan life. They were blind to the insults they gave daily. They requisitioned food and supplies with an air of entitlement, paying little or nothing. British soldiers, bored and drunk, would wander into the city bazaars, harassing merchants and insulting women, each act a spark landing on dry tinder. Sir William Macnaghten, the chief political officer, was the most deluded of all. He lived in a grand house near the cantonment, convinced he was a master diplomat, skillfully playing the tribes against one another. He held court, received petitions, and wrote glowing reports back to India, all while the ground was crumbling beneath his feet. He heard the whispers of dissent, but dismissed them as the grumblings of a few malcontents. One of the most vivid symbols of this disconnect was the ice. The officers discovered a frozen pond near the cantonment, and, with great excitement, fashioned skates from wood and iron. Soon, the bizarre spectacle of red-coated men gliding gracefully over the ice became a daily entertainment. They would laugh and shout, their breath misting in the cold air, completely oblivious to the Afghan men who would stop and watch from a distance, their faces grim and unreadable. What the British saw as a charming winter sport, the Afghans saw as a profound act of disrespect. Frivolous games played on their land by an infidel force. The sight of these men dancing on frozen water while their country was being held captive was an insult that cut deeper than any sword. It was a display of such complete and utter contempt that it unified disparate clans in a shared sense of outrage. The parties were not just parties, they were a political statement. They declared, "We are not afraid of you. We do not respect you. This land is ours to play in." And so, as the wine flowed in the cantonment, the poison of resentment seeped deeper into the heart of Kabul. In the mosques, mullahs began to preach a quiet jihad, their words weaving a tapestry of religious duty and national pride. In the hidden courtyards of the city, tribal leaders met in secret, their plans growing bolder with each new report of British insolence. The British were living in a dream, a pleasant fantasy of colonial life, but it was a dream from which they were about to be woken by a nightmare. Every laugh in their ballroom, every cheer at their horse race, was another nail being hammered into their own coffin. They believed they were invincible, protected by the might of the world's greatest empire. They had forgotten the oldest rule of war: never underestimate your enemy. and never ever mistake his silence for surrender. The laughter from the British cantonment never reached the high passes, but the stories did. They travelled not on the wind, but in the hushed tones of merchants, in the coded messages of nomadic herdsmen, and in the urgent warnings of travellers moving between the city and the remote tribal valleys. These were not mere rumours. They were currents of electricity passing through the nation, awakening a dormant fury. The whispers began as trickles of discontent, but soon merged into a river of shared grievance. The Farangius, one would say, in a Jalalabad bazaar, have turned our king into a dog on a leash. In a Kandahar tea house, another would murmur, their soldiers look upon our women with hungry eyes. And in the mountain villages of the Ghilzai, a chieftain would spit on the ground and declare, they pay for our grain with paper and contempt. The hills were no longer just watching, they were speaking. And their language was the ancient dialect of rebellion. This growing network of whispers was invisible to the British. To them, the landscape was just rock and dust, the people a faceless, brown mass. They could not comprehend a society where power was decentralized, where a man's loyalty was first to his clan, his tribe, and his faith, not to a distant king in a fortified palace. They failed to understand that Afghanistan was not a single entity to be conquered, but a complex web of alliances and blood feuds, a place where honor was a currency more valuable than gold. Every perceived insult from the occupiers, a requisitioned sheep, a casually spoken blasphemy, the very presence of unveiled white women was a tear in this delicate web. And men, like Abdullah Khan Achaksai, a powerful Durrani chief, began to meticulously gather these torn threads, weaving them into a rope strong enough to hang an empire. He and others met not in grand councils, but in the quiet of their own forts, sharing information and gauging the rising temperature of their people. The whispers gave birth to a chilling refrain that echoed from the Khyber Pass to the plains of Herat. The hills are not at peace. It was a phrase that carried a double meaning. On the surface, it was a simple statement of fact. The land was restless. But beneath, it was a solemn vow. It was a promise that, as long as a single foreign soldier stood on Afghan soil, there would be no peace. It was a declaration of a war that had not yet been officially declared, a war to be fought not on open battlefields, but in the shadows, in the narrow defiles, and in the minds of the people. The British heard the phrase, of course. A junior officer might overhear it from a local servant and dismiss it as native poetry. A political agent might note it in a report, but frame it as a minor tribal squabble. They heard the words, but they could not understand the music. They failed to recognize it as the anthem of their own destruction. Inside Kabul, the whispers became bolder. They slithered through the packed alleyways of the Shore Bazaar, where the scent of spices mingled with the stench of sedition. Mullahs, once cautious, began to speak more openly in the mosques, framing the British presence not as a political issue but as a mortal threat to Islam. They spoke of jihad not as a call to immediate, suicidal violence, but as a sacred duty, a spiritual preparation for the coming storm. They reminded their congregations that the mountains had defeated Alexander, and that the faith had outlasted Genghis Khan. This was not just a fight for land, it was a fight for God. The whispers were forging a new, terrifying unity, a bond between the tribal warrior and the urban cleric, between the proud Pashtun chieftain and the humble Tajik merchant. They were all becoming Afghans in a way they had not been before, united by a common enemy. As the second year of the occupation wore on, the whispers began to take physical form. A lone British sentry would disappear from his post at night, leaving behind only a dark stain in the dust. A small supply convoy would be found with its guards slain and its goods plundered, the work attributed to common bandits. The British saw these as isolated criminal acts, failing to see the pattern, the rising crescendo. They were the first notes of a symphony of violence. The whispers had done their work. They had prepared the ground, sown the seeds of hatred, and nourished them with every act of British arrogance. The hills were not at peace because the people were not at peace. And a man was now rising to give that restless anger a voice and a sword. The whispers were about to find their commander. The whispers needed a voice, and the anger needed a leader. He emerged not from the shadows, but from a legacy of defiance. Wazir Akbar Khan, the son of the deposed Dost Muhammad Khan, was a man forged in the crucible of Afghan politics and warfare. He was handsome, charismatic, and possessed a mind as sharp and unforgiving as the Khyber knife he carried at his side. While the British saw him as a disgruntled prince, a relic of a defeated regime, the Afghan people saw him as the living embodiment of their lost honor. He had his father's cunning and a ferocity that was entirely his own. When he returned to the lands near Kabul, his presence was not a secret to be hidden, but a banner to be raised. His arrival was the spark that the scattered embers of rebellion had been waiting for. Akbar Khan did not begin by calling for a great army to march on Kabul. He was too shrewd for that. He knew the British were masters of the open field, their disciplined lines of infantry and thundering cannons capable of crushing any tribal horde. His war would be fought differently. He began by organizing not an army, in the British sense, but a web. He moved like a phantom through the tribal territories, his small band of loyal followers swelling with each village he visited. He met with the powerful Ghilzai chiefs, men who controlled the vital passes between Kabul and India. He did not command them, he persuaded them. He sat with them in their tents, sharing their food, listening to their grievances, and speaking the language of Pashtunwali, the ancient code of honor, hospitality, and revenge. He reminded them that the land their ancestors had died for was now being defiled by infidels. He spoke of Shah Shujah's weakness and the arrogance of Macnaghten. He did not need to invent reasons for rebellion. He simply held up a mirror to the reality the chiefs already knew in their hearts. His strategy was one of 1,000 cuts. He began to orchestrate the small, seemingly random attacks that the British had been dismissing as banditry. He gave them purpose. The disappearing sentry was no longer a random crime, it was a message. The plundered convoy was not just theft, it was a strangulation of the enemy's lifeline. Akbar Khan taught his followers the art of the ghost war. Do not fight them where they are strong, he would say. Strike them where they are weak. Strike their supply lines. Strike their messengers. Strike their pride. Let them feel the fear of the unseen. Make the mountains their prison. He organized a network of spies within Kabul itself, servants in British households, merchants in the bazaar, even guards on the payroll of Shah Shujah. They fed him a constant stream of information, the number of British troops, their morale, the layout of the cantonment, the routines of their senior officers. He knew Macnaghten's mind better than Macnaghten knew his own. The British, in their insulated world, remained blissfully unaware of the storm gathering around them. They heard rumors of Akbar Khan's presence, but they underestimated him completely. To them, he was just another Afghan savage, prone to bluster and betrayal, but incapable of sustained, strategic action. Macnaghten, in a moment of supreme folly, even believed he could buy him. He sent emissaries with offers of gold and titles, hoping to bribe the son of the man he had overthrown. Akbar Khan played along, meeting with the British agents, feigning interest in their offers. He took their money and used it to buy weapons for his fighters. He used their arrogance against them, lulling them into a false sense of security while he tightened the noose. He was not just organizing a military resistance. He was waging a psychological war. He was turning the British confidence into a weapon that would be used against them. As the autumn of 1841 approached, the secret resistance was no longer a secret to the Afghans, it was a shared promise. Akbar Khan had succeeded in uniting the fiercely independent and often warring tribes of eastern Afghanistan under a single cause, the expulsion of the British. He had given their anger a focus and their hatred a plan. The whispers that had once spread through the hills had now become a single unified voice, and that voice belonged to Akbar Khan. The British were still hosting their parties, still skating on their frozen ponds, oblivious to the fact that their playground was about to become a killing field. The web was woven, the trap was set. All that was needed was a single violent act to signal that the real war had begun. The spark fell on a crisp autumn day in October 1841. It was not a grand battle. Not a dramatic clash of armies, but a small, brutal, and deeply personal act of violence that tore through the fragile illusion of peace. General Sale, a man known for his aggressive tactics, was leading a force out of Kabul to clear the Kabul Pass, the main artery back to India, which had become increasingly troubled by Ghilzai snipers. The British still viewed this as a policing action, a routine mission to chastise the natives and reopen the road. They marched with their customary discipline, their redcoats a stark and arrogant slash of color against the brown and gray of the Afghan landscape. They believed they were the hunters. They were about to become the prey. As a smaller patrol from Sale's force ventured deeper into the narrowest part of the pass, the world exploded. The silence of the hills was shattered by the sudden crack of Jaziles, the long-barreled Afghan rifles firing from the cliffs above. The shots were not a wild volley, but a series of precise, deliberate strikes. One moment, a British officer was shouting an order from his horse. The next, he was a crumpled heap in the dust. A soldier marching in line suddenly staggered, a look of shocked surprise on his face, before collapsing. Panic, a feeling long absent from the British ranks, began to take hold. The soldiers could see nothing but puffs of smoke high above them. They were firing at ghosts. Their own muskets, the famous Brown Bess, were inaccurate at such a range. They were firing blindly into the rocks. Their volleys, a futile roar of frustration against an invisible, deadly enemy. The ambush was a masterpiece of Afghan guerrilla warfare, almost certainly coordinated by Akbar Khan's lieutenants. The Ghilzai fighters knew every inch of this terrain. They were camouflaged, patient, and deadly. They would fire a single shot and then melt back into the rocks, moving to a new position before the British could even pinpoint their location. For the soldiers trapped in the pass, it was terrifying. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere at once. The majestic mountains that had seemed so picturesque on their march into Kabul now felt like the walls of a trap. Closing in on them, the patrol was cut to pieces. The survivors scrambled back to the main force, carrying their wounded. Their faces etched with a new and unfamiliar emotion, fear. When the news of the ambush reached the cantonment in Kabul, it was met not with alarm, but with indignant fury. Sir William McNaughton was outraged. This was not just an attack. It was an act of insolent defiance. It was a direct challenge to his authority and the might of the British Empire. His response was driven by pride, not strategy. He demanded immediate and harsh retribution. He failed to see the ambush for what it was, a deliberate provocation, a baited trap. Akbar Khan was not trying to win a battle in the Kabul Pass. He was trying to ignite a fire in the city of Kabul itself. He knew that a British defeat, however small, would be seen as a sign of weakness. It would embolden the waverers and prove to the people of Kabul that the Phalangists were not invincible. The tension in the city, already at a breaking point, now became electric. The news of the successful ambush spread through the bazaars like wildfire. The whispers turned into excited chatter. The Afghan fighters were no longer ghosts, they were heroes. The British, for the first time, looked vulnerable. You could see the change in the way the Kabulis looked at the soldiers who walked their streets. The veneer of fearful respect was gone, replaced by a glint of defiance in their eyes. The British officers, in turn, became more aggressive, their arrogance curdling into a nervous hostility. The cantonment gates were shut earlier, became jumpier. The fragile peace was dead. The ambush in the pass was the first stone of an avalanche. It had proven the British could bleed. Now, the whole city was ready to find out if they could be broken. The air grew heavy, charged with the anticipation of violence. Everyone knew something was about to happen. The only questions were when and where the first blow would fall. The avalanche began on the morning of November 2nd, 1841. The target was not the heavily armed cantonment, but a single house in the heart of the city. It was the home of Sir Alexander Burnes, McNaughton's second-in-command, and one of the primary architects of the invasion. Burnes was a man who embodied British arrogance. He was brilliant, ambitious, and notoriously contemptuous of Afghan customs, particularly regarding women. He had been warned repeatedly by his own spies and even by Shah Shujah that his life was in danger, that the city was a powder keg. He dismissed the warnings with a laugh. "We are masters here," he had boasted. That morning, he was proven fatally wrong. As dawn broke, a small crowd gathered outside his house. It began with shouts, then curses, then the throwing of stones. It was the beginning of a flash flood of pent-up rage. Inside, Burns, still believing he could control the situation with his charisma, stepped onto a balcony to address the mob. He tried to reason with them, to placate them with promises of redress. It was like trying to reason with a forest fire. His words were swallowed by a roar of pure hatred. The crowd was no longer a small group of malcontents. It was swelling, by the minute, fed by people pouring in from every alleyway and bazaar. The guards at his door were overwhelmed. The gate was smashed open, and the mob surged into the compound. The chaos was absolute. Burns, his brother, and his military escort were hacked to pieces, their bodies mutilated in a frenzy of violence. The treasury within the house was looted, the sight of British gold further inflaming the rioters. The rebellion had found its first victory, and the taste of blood drove it mad. The sound of the rioter, terrifying human roar mixed with the splintering of wood and the crackle of flames carried to the British cantonment, less than 2 miles away. The officers heard it. The soldiers heard it. And they did nothing. This was the moment of catastrophic failure, the point at which the fate of the entire Kabul force was sealed. Major General Elphinstone, the commander, was paralyzed by indecision. He was old, sick, and terrified of making a mistake. He listened to conflicting advice. Some junior officers urged him to march a column of troops into the city immediately, arguing that a swift, decisive show of force could crush the uprising before it spread. Others, more cautious, warned that it could be a trap, that sending troops into the winding narrow streets of Kabul would be suicide. Elphinstone vacillated. He called for reports. He held a council. He waited. And while he waited, the fire spread. The murder of Burns was a signal. All across Kabul, the rebellion exploded. Afghan fighters who had been waiting for this moment emerged from their hiding places. The city's police force, loyal to their people and not the puppet king, joined the rebels. Shops owned by merchants who had collaborated with the British were set on fire. The Great Bazaar, the heart of the city's commerce, became a battleground. From the ramparts of the Bala Hissa, Shah Shujah watched in terror as his kingdom dissolved into anarchy below. He sent desperate messages to the cantonment, begging for help, but no help came. The British had promised to protect him, but in the moment of truth, they abandoned him. Trapped by their own incompetence and fear, by midday, the city of Kabul belonged to the rebels. The British had lost control, not in a battle, but through a complete collapse of will. The failure to act decisively on that first morning was a mortal wound. It sent a clear message to every Afghan, from the highest chief to the lowest beggar. The British were afraid. Their power, which had seemed so absolute, was a hollow shell. The chaos was no longer just a riot, it was a full-blown insurrection, a declaration of war from an entire city. The British were no longer occupiers, they were a besieged garrison. The mob that had murdered Burns had not just killed a man. They had killed the myth of British invincibility. The cantonment, once a symbol of their power and confidence, was now nothing more than a prison. And the walls of that prison were closing in. The fire of rebellion that had consumed Kabul now encircled the British cantonment, transforming it from a symbol of imperial confidence into a cage of despair. The decision to not march into the city on that first day was a fatal miscalculation. It had been a surrender of initiative, and in war, initiative is everything. Now, the British were no longer the aggressors. They were the besieged. The sprawling, poorly defended camp, chosen for its pleasant meadows and proximity to the racecourse, became a death trap. The low mud walls, barely high enough to stop a determined horseman, offered little protection from the Jalalabad fire that now rained down from the surrounding hills and nearby forts. Every trip to the river for water, every patrol outside the perimeter, became a deadly gamble. Afghan snipers, masters of camouflage and patience, were everywhere. A soldier could be walking between tents one moment and lying dead the next, the victim of a bullet from an unseen enemy. The chaos outside was matched by a growing panic within. The cantonment was not just a military camp, it was a city in miniature, crowded with thousands of camp followers, servants, cooks, merchants, and the wives and children of both British and Indian soldiers. These civilians, who had come to Afghanistan in the confident wake of the army, were now trapped alongside the troops. Their presence a constant heartbreaking reminder of the stakes. Food, which had once been plentiful, began to run out. The British had inexplicably built their main supply depot in a separate, small fort outside the main cantonment walls. In the first days of the uprising, Afghan forces swarmed it. The small garrison defending it fought bravely but was overwhelmed. The loss was catastrophic. The army's winter provision sacks of grain, salted meat, remor fell into enemy hands. The besiegers would now feast while the besieged began to starve. As the days turned into weeks, a gnawing, relentless hunger set in. Rations were cut. Again and again, the once proud soldiers of the Queen were reduced to eating their own cavalry horses and baggage animals. The fine chargers that had once pranced on the racecourse were now slaughtered for their stringy meat. Starvation eroded discipline faster than any enemy bullet. The Indian sepoys, many of whom were high-caste Hindus, were horrified at the prospect of eating horse and beef, a violation of their deepest religious principles. Morale plummeted. The cold, which had been a novelty, now became a deadly enemy. Winter arrived with a vengeance, blanketing the cantonment in snow. The troops, lacking proper winter clothing and weakened by hunger, began to succumb to frostbite and disease. The makeshift hospital, a scene of horror with its overflowing wards of wounded and sick, offered little hope. The neat rows of tents became a squalid frozen slum, the ground littered with filth and the bodies of animals. The vibrant, arrogant community that had hosted balls and theatricals was now a starving, freezing mob, united only by a shared and growing terror. General Elphinstone, frail and racked with indecision, seemed to shrink with his army's fortunes, a ghost of a commander presiding over a dying force. The trap, so long in the making, had finally sprung. Hope, in the besieged cantonment, was a currency more scarce than food. With every passing day, the situation grew more desperate. The military options had evaporated. A breakout was deemed suicidal. The starving, demoralized troops would be cut to pieces before they got a mile. Surrender was unthinkable, a stain on the honor of the empire. And so, Sir William Macnaghten, the man whose political ambitions had led them into this disaster, turned to the only path left: negotiation. He, the master diplomat who had believed he could control Afghanistan with treaties and gold, was now forced to bargain for his very survival. And the man he had to bargain with was the one he had underestimated most: Wazir Akbar Khan. Akbar Khan had, by this point, become the undisputed leader of the insurrection. He was the center of the storm, directing the siege, uniting the tribal chiefs, and holding the fate of the British in his hands. He agreed to meet. The negotiations were a study in contrasts. Macnaghten, the representative of the world's greatest power, arrived desperate and humbled. Akbar Khan, the leader of a supposedly backward people, met him with an air of cool, confident authority. He was no longer the rebel prince. He was the de facto ruler of the kingdom. The meetings took place in the open, on the cold ground near the cantonment, surrounded by the armed followers of both sides. A tense, theatrical tableau of shifting power. Macnaghten, clinging to the last vestiges of imperial pride, tried to dictate terms. Akbar Khan simply listened, his dark eyes revealing nothing. The deal that was hammered out was a complete and utter humiliation for the British. They had to agree to abandon Kabul entirely. They had to leave behind most of their cannons and heavy weapons. They had to hand over hostages to guarantee their compliance. And most galling of all, they had to pay a massive sum of money for their own safe. passage, effectively funding the very rebellion that had defeated them. In return, Akbar Khan promised to provide an escort to ensure the column was not attacked by the tribes, and to supply them with food for their journey to Jalalabad, the nearest British-held garrison. Macnaghten, seeing no other choice, agreed. He was a drowning man, grasping at a serpent, hoping it was a rope. He chose to trust the word of a man whose father he had deposed and whose country he had invaded. On December 23, in a final, desperate act of treachery or folly, Macnaghten held one last secret meeting with Akbar Khan. He proposed a new deal, to betray his own agreement, to help Akbar Khan become the vizier to the puppet king Shah Shujah, and to keep a British force in Kabul. It was a pathetic, last-ditch gamble. Akbar Khan, who had been warned of the duplicity, listened to the proposal. Then, in a sudden, shocking explosion of violence, he himself seized Macnaghten. "You are a dog," he is said to have shouted, before shooting the British envoy with a pair of ornate pistols that Macnaghten himself had recently given him as a gift. The British envoy's body was dragged into the city, where it was dismembered and put on public display in the bazaar. The ultimate diplomat had met the ultimate end. The deal for safe passage was now stained with the blood of the man who had made it. And yet, it was the only hope they had left. The British, now leaderless and terrified, had to decide whether to trust the promise of a man who had just murdered their chief. They had no choice. The retreat was their only option. It was a march into the jaws of winter, guaranteed only by the word of their sworn enemy. The exodus began on January 6, 1842. It was not a military retreat. It was the flight of a broken people. A staggering column of 16,000 souls, 4,500 soldiers, and more than 12,000 civilian camp followers shuffled out of the cantonment gates for the last time. They left behind a scene of utter desolation, the smoldering remains of their camp, the graves of their comrades, and the last vestiges of their imperial pride. The sky above was a sheet of metallic grey, promising more snow. The air was so cold, it felt like breathing in shards of glass. This was the army that had marched into Kabul with triumphant music and fluttering banners. Now, they were a slow-moving river of misery, a ragged procession of ghosts trudging towards a destination they prayed they would reach, but which few truly believed they would. The 90-mile journey to Jalalabad, through some of the most treacherous mountain terrain on earth, lay before them. The column was a portrait of human suffering. The soldiers, once the disciplined pride of the company, were now gaunt figures wrapped in tattered blankets, their red coats faded and filthy. They clutched their muskets with frostbitten fingers, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and grim resignation. The Indian sepoys, men from the warm plains of Hindustan, were suffering the most. Unaccustomed to such brutal cold, many were already crippled by frostbite, their thin cotton uniforms offering no protection against the Afghan winter. They stumbled forward, their minds filled with thoughts of the homes they would never see again. But it was the civilians who presented the most heartbreaking spectacle. Women of high society, like Lady Sale, who had once presided over elegant dinner parties, were now mounted on swaying camels or trudging through the snow alongside common soldiers. They tried to maintain a stoic dignity, but their eyes betrayed their terror. And then there were the thousands of others, the servants, the cooks, the merchants, the wives and children of the Indian soldiers. They were the forgotten casualties of this imperial adventure. They carried what few possessions they could salvage on their backs or on overburdened ponies. Babies cried, their wails thin and lost in the vast frozen landscape. Old men and women, their strength failing, struggled to keep up their faces. Masks of quiet despair. The column stretched for miles, a chaotic, disorganized mass moving at a snail's pace. There was no order, no discipline. It was every man, woman, and child for themselves. The promises made by Akbar Khan already felt like a distant dream. The promised food supplies had not fully materialized. The promised escort was thin and seemed more like a group of guards than protectors. The local Afghans who lined the route did not watch them with pity. but with a cold, predatory gaze. They saw not a retreating army, but a treasure train, laden with loot and helpless victims. As they left the relative shelter of the Kabul Valley and entered the mouth of the Kabul Pass, a sense of claustrophobia descended upon the column. The snow-covered mountains rose up on either side like colossal white walls, sealing them. In the path was narrow and treacherous, covered in ice and deepening snow. Mules and camels slipped and fell, their legs breaking with an audible crack, their cargo spilling into the drifts. The people at the back of the column could hear the sounds of trouble, ahead shouts, screams, the occasional gunshot, but could see nothing. They could only keep moving forward, stepping over the bodies of those who had already fallen into the white, frozen hell that awaited them. The retreat had barely begun, but it already felt like a funeral procession. They were marching away from a city that had broken them and into the unforgiving embrace of a winter that was waiting to devour them whole. The first enemy they faced was not the Afghan warrior, but the Afghan winter. It was a foe far more relentless and indiscriminate than any human army. The cold was a physical presence, a predator that stalked every member of the column, from the highest-ranking officer to the smallest child. It was a deep, penetrating cold that no amount of clothing could keep at bay. It seeped into their bones, slowing their blood, dulling their minds. The temperature plummeted far below freezing, and the wind that howled down from the high peaks was a razor, slicing through their tattered uniforms and thin blankets, stealing the warmth from their bodies with merciless efficiency. The very air they breathed seemed to turn to ice in their lungs. Before a single Jazil was fired in earnest, the column began to disintegrate under the assault of the cold. The first to fall were the most vulnerable. The Indian camp followers, men and women from the sun-drenched plains of the Ganges, were utterly unprepared for this Arctic hell. Their bare or poorly shod feet were the first to go. Frostbite, a word many had never even heard, became a terrifying reality. It began as a numbness, a welcome relief from the biting pain, but soon their toes and fingers turned black and hard. As stone, they would stumble and fall into the snow, too weak and frozen to rise again. At first, others would try to help them, to pull them to their feet. But soon, compassion became a luxury no one could afford. The instinct for survival took over. To stop was to die. The living were forced to step over the dying, leaving them behind as silent, frozen statues in the snow, their dark eyes staring blankly at the grey sky. The soldiers fared little better. The British redcoats and the sepoys' cotton uniforms, designed for battles in the Indian heat, were useless here. Men who had survived gunfire and cannonades now found themselves defeated by an enemy they could not fight. They huddled together for warmth at night, but there was no escape. Sleep was a dangerous temptation, a siren call into a frozen death. Many who lay down to rest simply never woke up, their bodies discovered in the morning, stiff and covered in a dusting of fresh snow. The simple act of loading a musket became an agonizing task for men whose fingers were numb and clumsy with cold. Discipline, the bedrock of the British Army, dissolved in the face of this universal suffering. The neat, marching columns broke apart into a desperate shuffling mob, each individual locked in a solitary battle against the elements. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical one. The relentless cold created a waking nightmare. The world was reduced to a monochrome of white snow and black rock. The only sound, the crunch of feet, the moaning of the wind, and the quiet sobs of the hopeless. Men became delirious, seeing mirages of warm fires and comfortable homes. They would wander off the path, chasing these phantoms, only to collapse and disappear into the snowdrifts. The will to live began to flicker and die. What was the point of struggling onward when death seemed to offer the only release from the pain? The bullets had not yet begun to fly in great numbers, but the army was already being decimated. The cold was the advance guard of the Afghan attack, a silent and brutally effective force that was weeding out the weak, breaking their spirit, and preparing them for the slaughter that was to come. The column was not just marching through the snow, it was being consumed by it. The first shots came without warning, sharp cracks echoing from the cliffs above. They were not the thunderous volleys of a European battle, but the precise, personal punctuation marks of death. The Ghilzai tribesmen, who considered these passes their ancestral land, had been waiting. They were phantoms in the landscape, their dark clothing blending perfectly with the rocks, their patience absolute. They watched the miserable column crawl into the narrowest part of the Kabul Pass, a place where the path was barely wide enough for two men to walk abreast, and the cliff soared hundreds of feet on either side. It was a perfect killing ground, and they were the masters of it. They did not waste their ammunition on the main body of troops. Their targets were chosen with cruel intelligence. They aimed for the stragglers. The man who paused to adjust his pack, the woman who stopped to comfort a crying child, the sepoy who stumbled and fell behind, these were the ones who died first. A single shot would ring out, and a figure at the tail end of the column would collapse into the snow, often without a sound. The others would glance back, their faces hollow with fear, and then hurry onward, knowing that to stop, even for a moment, was to paint a target on their own back. The snipers also aimed for the officers. They could be identified by their horses, their slightly better uniforms, or the way they tried to shout orders. To kill an officer was to kill morale, to cut the head from the snake. One by one, the leaders who were trying to maintain some semblance of order were picked off, their bodies tumbling from their saddles to be swallowed by the snow and the chaos. This was a form of warfare the British were completely unprepared for. It was intimate and terrifying. The enemy was invisible, his presence felt only through the sudden death of a comrade. The soldiers would fire their brown Bess muskets wildly at the cliffs, but it was a futile gesture. They were firing at rocks and shadows, while the Afghans, armed with their long-barreled, accurate Jaziels, could take their time, rest their rifles on a rock, and choose their victims with chilling precision. The pass became a gallery of slaughter. The high walls echoed with the crack of the Jaziels, the whistle of the bullets, the screams of the wounded, and the panicked shouts of the living. The sense of being hunted was absolute. There was no cover, no place to hide. The only defense was to keep moving, to push forward through the deepening snow, hoping that the next shot would not be for you. The psychological impact was immense. The constant unseen threat shattered what little nerve the soldiers had left. Paranoia set in. Every rock, every shadow seemed to hold a hidden marksman. The army, which had been trained to fight in disciplined lines on open fields, was now reduced to a terrified mob, scurrying through a ravine while being tormented by an enemy they could not see and could not fight. The snipers were not just killing them. They were dissecting them, taking the column apart piece by piece from the rear. The tail of the procession, where the weakest and most vulnerable civilians were, simply ceased to exist. It was erased, its members shot down or captured by the tribesmen, who would descend from the cliffs to loot the bodies and seize the women and children. The retreat was no longer a march, it was a desperate, stumbling flight through a gauntlet of death, and the snipers on the cliffs were the gatekeepers of hell. The road to Jalalabad was paved with abandoned hope. As the sniper fire intensified and the cold deepened its grip, the column began to shed everything that was not essential for the immediate, desperate act of survival. The first things to go were the symbols of the life they had left behind. Heavy wooden chests filled with dress uniforms, silver cutlery, and fine porcelain, the very items that had once defined their status in the cantonment, were now just dead weight. They were pushed off the backs of struggling mules and left to sink into the snow. Their contents a bizarre and tragic testament to a world that no longer existed. Crates of books, personal letters, and family heirlooms were discarded without a second thought. The past was a burden, and the future was a few hundred yards of blood-stained snow. The only tense that mattered was the present. Next went the tools of war. The heavy cannons, which had been dragged with immense effort, became impossible to move through the narrow icy passes. Their wheels became stuck, their axles broke. With no way to move them and no time to spare, they were spiked and abandoned, their silent muzzles pointing accusingly at the grey sky. Sacks of ammunition, once more precious than gold, were now too heavy to carry. They were left behind, a gift to the very enemy who was slaughtering them. The logic of an organized army had completely inverted. The tools meant to protect them were now anchors, dragging them down to their deaths. Survival depended not on what you could carry, but on what you could afford to leave behind. The most agonizing act of abandonment, however, was the leaving of the wounded. In the first day or two, they had tried. Comrades would fashion makeshift stretchers or help a wounded friend hobble along. But the pace of the column was merciless. The snipers targeted those who were helping the injured, making compassion a suicidal act. A man carrying a wounded friend was a slow, easy target. Soon, the terrible choice had to be made. A soldier would go down, his leg shattered by a jazzle ball, and his friends would look at him with anguish, exchange a glance of shared, grim understanding, and then move on, leaving him to his fate. The cries of the wounded, begging not to be left behind, haunted the living. "For God's sake, don't leave me," they would scream, their voices growing fainter as the column shuffled past. They were left to die of their wounds, to freeze to death in the snow, or to face the Afghan tribesmen who would descend from the hills, to finish them off with their long knives. This abandonment of the wounded was the ultimate breakdown of military and human discipline. It was the moment the army ceased to be an army and became a collection of desperate, terrified individuals. The social contract that binds soldiers together, the promise that we will never leave a man behind, was broken, shattered by the brutal calculus of survival. Lady Sale, watching from her camel, wrote in her diary of the horror of seeing men she knew, men who had danced in her ballroom, left to die on the side of the path. The snow-covered trail behind the column became a horrific tableau of discarded lives, the frozen bodies of men, women, and children lying amidst the splintered remains of personal luggage and the useless hardware of war. The retreat was no longer just a flight. It was a process of purification through suffering, stripping away everything: possessions, weapons, and finally, humanity itself. It was a place that would forever be known as the Valley of Death. The column, now a ragged, bleeding artery of humanity, squeezed into the Tangi Tariki, a gorge so narrow and deep that the sky was reduced to a mere sliver of grey light between the towering black rock walls. The path was a frozen streambed, littered with boulders and slick with ice. The cliffs on either side were sheer, almost vertical, creating a natural killbox from which there was no escape. The air was still and silent, a terrifying, unnatural quiet that felt heavier than the howling wind they had left behind. The Afghans had been waiting for this. The sniper fire that had tormented the column was merely the prelude. This was to be the symphony. The attack did not begin with a warning shot. It began with a roar. From the cliffs above, hundreds, perhaps thousands of Ghilzai warriors, who had been hiding in crevices and behind ledges, rose as one. They unleashed a devastating plunging fire directly into the dense mass of people trapped below. It was not sniping, it was butchery. Jazzile balls ripped through the packed ranks, each bullet often passing through 2 or 3 bodies before stopping. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The front of the column dissolved into a screaming, writhing mass of death. Men, women, and animals went down in heaps, their bodies clogging the narrow passage, creating a gruesome dam of flesh and bone. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The rock walls offered no cover, only an echo for the screams. For the soldiers, it was the ultimate nightmare. They could not form a line, could not return fire effectively. They were a helpless herd, being slaughtered from above. They would raise their muskets and fire upwards, but it was a gesture of pure desperation. They were firing at a sky filled with smoke and fleeting shadows. Panic, absolute and primal, seized the column. The desperate push to move forward, to escape the confines of the gorge, turned into a frantic, deadly stampede. The living trampled the dead and dying, their boots slipping on blood-frozen ice. The narrow pass became a meat grinder, a churning vortex of terror and death. Then, The second wave of the attack began. As the firing from above continued, warriors descended the steep slopes. Moving with a speed and agility that seemed superhuman, they fell upon the flanks and rear of the column, their long curved knives flashing in the dim light. This was not a battle. It was a harvest. They swept through the terrified camp followers, cutting them down without mercy. The chaos was absolute. The distinction between soldier and civilian, man and woman, adult and child, vanished. All were victims, caught in a storm of steel and lead. The screams of the slaughtered, the triumphant war cries of the Afghans, and the ceaseless crack of the Jaziles blended into a single deafening sound of annihilation. In the space of a few hours, thousands perished. The floor of the gorge disappeared under a carpet of bodies. The frozen stream ran red. The British and Indian soldiers who tried to form pockets of resistance were quickly overwhelmed, surrounded, and cut down. The rearguard, which had been fighting a desperate battle since the retreat began, was swallowed whole, vanishing completely. The massacre at Tangi Tariki was the death blow to the army of Kabul. It was not a defeat, it was an erasure. The force that had left the cantonment days earlier as a struggling column was now just a handful of blood-spattered, traumatized survivors who had managed to break through the initial chaos. They stumbled out of the far end of the gorge, leaving behind them a valley of silence, filled with the dead. The heart of the army had been ripped out and left to freeze in the dark, narrow canyon. The retreat was no longer about reaching Jalalabad. It was now only about surviving the next hour. Out of the blood-soaked gorge of Tangi Tariki stumbled the remnants of the British command. General Elphinstone, so frail he could barely sit on his horse, was a man hollowed out by disaster. Brigadier Shelton, his second in command, a brave but abrasive man, was consumed by a furious, helpless rage. They were leaders of a ghost army, their authority extending no further than the few dozen freezing soldiers who now huddled around them. It was at this moment of ultimate weakness that a messenger arrived. He came from Akbar Khan. The message was an offer, a sliver of hope in a world that had none. Akbar Khan, the messenger said, was appalled by the massacre. He claimed it was the work of uncontrollable Ghilzai tribesmen, not his own command. He invited General Elphinstone and his senior officers to a conference. He promised to halt the attacks, provide food, and personally guarantee the safety of the remaining women and children, including Lady Sale, if they would place themselves under his protection as hostages. It was a transparent trap, a wolf offering to guard the last of the sheep. Every instinct should have screamed a warning, but they were out of options. The alternative was to continue the march and watch every last person, including the women and children, be slaughtered on the road. For Elphinstone and his advisors, it was a devil's bargain. Was it better to trust the man who had orchestrated their destruction, or to condemn everyone to certain death? The debate was brief and agonizing. The thought of saving the women and children was the deciding factor. It was a choice born not of strategy, but of a desperate, flickering ember of chivalry in the heart of a great darkness. With heavy hearts, they agreed. The meeting was a piece of grim theater. Elphinstone, Shelton, and a handful of other senior officers rode to the designated meeting point. A short distance from their own pathetic camp, Akbar Khan received them with a display of solemn courtesy. He offered them warm tea and bread, a gesture of hospitality that was both a comfort and a profound mockery. As they sat, shivering and exhausted, trying to negotiate the terms of their survival, the trap was sprung. It was done with quiet efficiency. Armed Afghan warriors, who had been waiting nearby, simply moved in and surrounded them. There was no struggle, no fight. The British officers were too weak, too few. Akbar Khan's demeanor changed. The mask of the concerned host fell away, revealing the cold, hard face of the victor. He informed them that they were now his prisoners, as he put it, his guests. He assured them they would be treated with honor, but they were hostages, bargaining chips to be used in the final stages of his victory over the British Empire. The detention of the High Command was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. It decapitated the retreating force completely. The few hundred soldiers and civilians who remained were now utterly leaderless, deprived of the very men who were supposed to guide them. When the news filtered back to their small, freezing camp, the last vestiges of hope died. They had been abandoned by their leaders, left to fend for themselves in the heart of a hostile wilderness. The deal was a lie. The promise of protection was a ruse. Akbar Khan had never intended to let them go. He had simply waited for the moment when they were at their most vulnerable. And then he had plucked the leadership away, leaving the body of the army to twitch and die on the road. The remaining survivors now faced the final, terrible truth. There would be no negotiation, no rescue. Their only path was forward, into the snow, into the guns of the enemy, alone. With the generals gone, the chain of command shattered. The entity that had once been the 44th Regiment of Foot and the various sepoy corps ceased to exist. What remained was no longer a military unit, but a frantic herd of terrified individuals. The concept of discipline, already eroded by starvation, cold, and fear, now evaporated completely. There was no one to give orders, and no one to obey them. The primal instinct for self-preservation, raw and absolute, took over. The column, which had at least maintained a semblance of a single body, now fractured into desperate, competing fragments. The bonds of comradeship, forged over years of service, snapped. Small groups of soldiers, believing they had a better chance on their own, broke away from the main group. They would strike out in a different direction, hoping to find a hidden path or a sympathetic village, guided by rumor or a mad flicker of hope. These splinter groups were easy prey. The Afghan tribesmen, watching from the hills, would wait for them to become separated and then descend, wiping them out in small, brutal skirmishes that no one else would ever witness. Their bodies were left in the snow, a testament to the folly of division. Other soldiers simply gave up. They would sit down by the side of the path, their muskets falling from their frozen hands, and wait for the end. They were consumed by a profound apathy, a weariness so deep that death seemed preferable to taking another step. They would watch their former comrades shuffle past, their eyes empty, until the cold or a tribesman's knife granted them their release. Desertion became a contagion. The Indian sepoys, seeing the utter collapse of British authority, felt their loyalty dissolve. They were thousands of miles from home, fighting and dying for a foreign power that had proven itself incompetent and incapable of protecting them. Many simply wandered away from the column, disappearing into the vast white landscape. Some may have sought shelter in villages, hoping for mercy. Most would have frozen to death alone, their dark bodies stark against the snow, a final lonely protest against the madness they had been dragged into. The British soldiers, too, broke ranks. Some, driven mad by the cold and horror, would charge wildly at the unseen enemy in the hills, firing their last rounds in a suicidal act of defiance before being cut down. The very structure of their world had collapsed. There was no rearguard to protect the weak, no vanguard to clear the path. The officers who remained had no authority. A lieutenant might try to rally a few men, but his words were lost in the wind. Who would follow a leader who was just as lost and terrified as they were? The column became a moving tableau of anarchy. Men fought over the last scraps of food. A fallen horse would be swarmed by starving soldiers, who would hack at its flesh with their bayonets, their faces wild and desperate. The distinction between British and Indian, soldier and civilian, blurred into a single, undifferentiated mass of suffering. They were no longer an army in retreat. They were a disorganized flight of human atoms, scattered by the storm of war, each one facing the end in profound and utter isolation. The final stage of their annihilation had begun, not with a bang, but with the quiet, inexorable process of falling apart. The story of the soldiers was one of broken discipline and shattered morale. The story of the civilians who trailed them was one of pure, unmitigated tragedy. They were the footnotes to the grand imperial policy, the human baggage of an army, and they died in their thousands. Their passing marked by a terrible, indifferent silence. They were the wives and children of the Indian sepoys, the merchants who had supplied the cantonment, the servants who had polished the officers' boots. They had no weapons, no training, no hope. They were protected only by the fiction that they were non-combatants, a distinction the Afghan winter and the Ghilzai warriors failed to recognize. As the column disintegrated, the civilians were the first to be cast adrift. They were at the back of the procession, the weakest and the slowest. And the gap between them and the fleeing soldiers grew with every passing hour. The road behind the last soldier became a landscape of quiet, individual horror. A mother, her strength finally gone, would sink to her knees in the snow, clutching her baby to her chest. She would not cry out. There was no energy left for anything but the final protective embrace. The child's cries would grow weaker and weaker until they were silenced by the cold. Other families, seeing that they could not keep up, would simply sit down together, a small silent circle of resignation, and wait for the end. They would huddle together for warmth, their dark eyes watching the last of the column disappear over a rise, leaving them utterly alone in a vast white world. No one looked back. It was the cruelest and most necessary rule of this new world. To look back was to see a friend, a neighbor, a child you knew, and to be paralyzed by a compassion that would kill you. The soldiers and the few civilians who were still able to keep pace had to harden their hearts into stone. They had to deafen their ears to the cries that followed them on the wind. They had to focus only on the next step, the next breath. Lady Sale, one of the few who was mounted and part of the protected hostage group, watched this tragedy unfold from a distance. She wrote of the terrible and continued sight of the dead and dying, of seeing women she knew sitting helplessly in the snow, their children frozen in their arms. Her words are a testament to the horror, but she too was powerless, a witness to a flood of misery she could do nothing to stop. The Afghan tribesmen who followed the column like wolves showed no mercy to these stragglers. They saw them as the spoils of war. They would descend from the hills, not with guns, but with knives and clubs. They would strip the dead and dying of their clothing, and any meager possessions they had. The women and older children who were still alive were often taken captive. Their fate, a terrifying unknown, destined for a life of slavery in a remote mountain village. For many, a quick death in the snow would have been a kinder end. The road to Jalalabad was becoming a graveyard, thousands of miles long, littered with the bodies of the forgotten. They were the true cost of the invasion, the innocent lives sacrificed on the altar of imperial ambition. Their deaths were not recorded in any official casualty list. They simply vanished, their stories untold, their bodies buried under the relentless, indifferent snow. The concept of a rearguard had become almost meaningless. As the army had dissolved into a panicked mob, yet, a small corps of soldiers, mostly from the British 44th Regiment of Foot, instinctively clung to their training. It was a group of perhaps 100 men, a mixture of veterans and raw recruits, who formed the final desperate barrier between the fleeing survivors and the pursuing Afghan hordes. They were no longer protecting an army. They were protecting a memory, a final defiant flicker of the discipline that had once been their creed. They were the last organized fragment of a shattered force, and their stand was an act of pure suicidal courage. They took their position on a small snow hillock, a slight rise in the terrain that offered a marginal defensive advantage. It was a pathetic fortress, but it was all they had. They formed a rough square, the classic British infantry formation for repelling cavalry. Though they were facing an enemy far more fluid and deadly. They were exhausted, starving, and their fingers were so numb with cold they could barely handle their muskets. Their iconic red coats were tattered and stained, their faces gaunt and blackened by frostbite and powder burns. They stood shoulder to shoulder, bayonets fixed. A tiny island of doomed defiance in a sea of hostile mountains. The Afghans, who had been harrying them for miles, now saw the opportunity for a final decisive slaughter. They gathered in their hundreds, swarming the hills around the British position. They did not charge recklessly. They were patient predators. They began by pouring a relentless fire into the small square. The British soldiers stood their ground, firing back in disciplined volleys, but their numbers were too few. For every tribesman they shot, 10 more seemed to appear. The square began to shrink as men fell, shot down one by one. The officers, who stood with their men, were the first to be targeted. They fell, and the non-commissioned officers would take their place, shouting encouragement, trying to hold the line together. While the British were focused on their revenge, a different kind of history was being written in the mountains and villages of Afghanistan. For the British, Wazir Akbar Khan was the villain of the story, a treacherous, bloodthirsty savage who had masterminded a massacre, but in the memory of his own people, he was transformed into something else entirely. He became a legend, a national hero, the man who had humbled the most powerful empire on earth. His name was spoken with reverence in the tea-houses and sung about in the epic poems of the Pashtun bards. He was the sword of the Afghan people, the embodiment of their fierce, unyielding spirit of independence. His victory was not seen as an act of treachery, but as a masterful display of strategic genius. He had used the British arrogance against them. He had lured them into a trap of their own making. He had understood, as the British had not, that in Afghanistan, the terrain, the climate, and the will of the people were more powerful than any army. The killing of MacNaughton, which the British viewed as a craven assassination, was seen by many Afghans as a justifiable act of war, the slaying of an enemy commander who was himself plotting betrayal. In the complex code of Pashtunwali, where revenge is a sacred duty, Akbar Khan had avenged the deposition of his father and the invasion of his homeland. The army of retribution, with its burning of villages and the destruction of the Great Bazaar, did not diminish his status. It enhanced it. Every act of British brutality only served to reinforce the narrative that Akbar Khan had been right. He had fought against a cruel and vengeful enemy, an infidel force that had no respect for Afghan life or culture. The smoking ruins of the bazaar were not a symbol of British power, but a testament to their barbarism. It proved that the resistance had been a righteous one. While the British saw their actions as a restoration of honor, the Afghans saw it as the petulant rage of a bully who had been defeated in a fair fight, and had returned to lash out at the innocent. Akbar Khan himself did not live long to enjoy his heroic status. He died a few years later, likely poisoned by his own jealous relatives in the endless cycle of internal Afghan power struggles. But his death did not tarnish his legend. In fact, it cemented it. He became a martyr, a figure frozen in time at the peak of his glory. He was the young, charismatic prince who had risen from exile to unite the tribes and expel the invaders. He represented a moment of pure, triumphant Afghan nationalism. While the British would remember the First Anglo Afghan War as a story of disaster and revenge, the Afghans would remember it as the story of Akbar Khan, the man who had taught an empire the meaning of fear and had proven to the world that the mountains of Afghanistan would never be conquered. After the smoke cleared over the ruins of the Great Bazaar and the last of the hostages were secured, a cold, hard reality settled upon the British command. They had achieved their revenge. They had demonstrated their capacity for destruction, but they had proved nothing else. The fundamental strategic dilemma remained unchanged. They could take Kabul, they could burn it, but they could not hold it. To stay would be to repeat the same fatal mistake that had led to Elphinstone's disaster. An army of occupation would require a constant bleeding supply line, and it would be surrounded by a populace whose hatred for the British had now been burned into their very souls by the army of retribution. To stay was to invite another massacre. And so, in October 1842, just 1 month after they had marched triumphantly back into the city, the British did the one thing they had sworn they would never do again. They retreated. This time, it was not a panicked flight. It was an orderly, disciplined withdrawal. The army of retribution marched out of Kabul with its guns and its standards intact, its soldiers marching in neat columns. But it was a retreat, nonetheless. They were abandoning the city, abandoning the country, abandoning the entire purpose for which the war had been fought. They left behind a smoking ruin where a bazaar had been, thousands of dead Afghans, and a puppet king, Shah Shujah, who was assassinated shortly after they left. His reign melting away the moment the foreign bayonets that propped him up were gone, as they marched back through the same passes where their comrades had perished. The soldiers were not jubilant. There was a grim, hollow feeling to their victory. They had avenged the dead, but what had it accomplished? They had not made Afghanistan a stable, friendly buffer state. They had turned it into a cauldron of enduring hatred. They had not enhanced British prestige. They had merely demonstrated that the empire was a sore loser, capable of immense cruelty in the face of humiliation. The local tribesmen watched them go, this time from a distance. They did not attack. They had already won the war that mattered. They had made their land so inhospitable, so dangerous, that the most powerful empire on earth had decided it was not worth the price. The second retreat was a quiet admission of utter failure. It was a tacit acknowledgement that the entire Afghan adventure, from the confident invasion in 1839 to the vengeful return in 1842, had been a catastrophic miscalculation. They had sacrificed nearly 20,000 lives, British, Indian, and countless thousands of Afghans, and had achieved absolutely nothing. They had not advanced their strategic interests. They had not won the loyalty of the people. They had not even left behind a government that was friendly to them. They left behind only ghosts, ruins, and a legacy of bitterness that would poison the relationship between the two nations for a century to come. The army of retribution marched home, but they left the victory in the mountains. The last soldier of the army of retribution disappeared back through the Khyber Pass, and a profound quiet settled over Kabul. The city, scarred and brutalized but unbroken, began the slow process of healing. The rubble of the Great Bazaar was gradually cleared away. The rhythms of life, which had been so violently disrupted, slowly returned. The British were gone. Shah Shujah was dead. And Dost Muhammad Khan, the very man the British had spent so much blood and treasure to depose, was eventually released from his exile in India and returned to the throne of Afghanistan. The great game had come full circle, ending exactly where it had begun. It was as if the entire invasion, the massacres, the revenge, had been a furious, bloody, and ultimately pointless dream. Kabul remained. The city, nestled in its high valley, had seen empires come and go. It had watched the Greeks of Alexander the Great march through, their spears glinting in the sun. It had endured the Mongol hordes of Genghis Khan. It had now seen the British, with their red coats and their powerful cannons, arrive with arrogance and leave in failure. The city was a silent witness, its ancient memory far longer than the fleeting ambitions of foreign powers. It understood a truth that the invaders never seemed to grasp, that it could be occupied, but never truly conquered. Its true defense was not its walls, but the fierce, indomitable spirit of the people who lived in the mountains that surrounded it. As the years turned into decades, the story of the British disaster became a cautionary tale, a legend whispered in the courts of other empires, yet the lesson was never truly learned. The strategic lure of Afghanistan, its position as a crossroads of Asia, continued to tempt foreign powers who believed that this time it would be different. They would come with new technologies, new ideologies, and the same old arrogance. In the 20th century, the British would fight a third war there. Later, the Soviets would arrive with their tanks and helicopters, convinced that their socialist vision could tame this unruly land. They too would leave, broken and defeated. Their mighty army, humbled by the same tactics that had destroyed Elphinstone. And after them, another great power from the West would come, with its drones and its special forces. And it too would learn the hard lesson of the Afghan graveyard. Kabul watched it all. A timeless observer of the cyclical folly of empires. The city saw history not as a line, but as a wheel, constantly turning, bringing new invaders who made the same mistakes, blinded by the same pride. The ghosts of Elphinstone's army seemed to linger in the passes, a permanent warning to those who would seek to impose their will on this land. The city remained, its spirit unconquered, its people resilient, forever watching the horizon for the next army, the next flag, the next lesson that would need to be taught. The names of the invaders changed, but the story remained the same. When the news finally crossed the oceans and arrived in the damp, foggy streets of London, it did not land like a report. It landed like a physical blow. The first whispers appeared in the private clubs of Pall Mall and the corridors of Whitehall, carried in hushed, horrified tones. Then, the newspapers got the story. The Times of London, in stark black ink, printed the dispatches from India. The headlines were blunt, brutal, and almost unbelievable. Annihilation of the British force in Afghanistan. Dreadful massacre of the troops. For the British public, steeped in a generation of imperial triumphs and the unshakable belief in their own manifest destiny. The words did not compute. It was as if they had been told the sun had fallen from the sky. The initial reaction was one of profound, stunned shock. Disbelief was the first defense. It had to be a mistake, an exaggeration, a lie concocted by Britain's enemies. How could an entire army, led by British officers and carrying the Queen's colours, be wiped out by a rabble of tribal warriors? The idea was fundamentally alien to the Victorian worldview, which saw history as a linear march of progress with Britain at its vanguard. The public had seen images of the Grand March into Kabul, read the confident reports from Macnaghten, and celebrated the successful installation of Shah Shujah. The story was supposed to be over, another tidy chapter in the glorious narrative of empire. This news was a horrifying, bloody epilogue that made no sense. But as more details trickled in, carried by subsequent ships the names of the dead, the horrific accounts of the retreat, the story of Lady Sale and the other shock hardened into a raw national grief, which then quickly curdled into a furious, vengeful rage. The public mood turned dark and violent. The disaster was no longer a distant military setback. It was a personal insult to every citizen of the empire. It was a stain on their honor, a humiliation on a global scale. In the pubs and parlors, the talk was of nothing else. The public, which had barely known where Afghanistan was a few years prior, was now consumed by a burning desire for retribution. This anger was not just directed outward at the Afghans. It was also turned inward, seeking culprits for the catastrophe. The names of Elphinstone and Macnaghten were dragged through the mud. They were condemned as incompetent, arrogant fools who had squandered the lives of brave British soldiers. Lord Auckland, the Governor-General, became a figure of national scorn. His forward policy now seen as a reckless and fatal gamble. But this search for blame was secondary to the overwhelming primal cry for revenge. The public did not want an inquiry, they wanted a war. They wanted to see Kabul burn. They wanted to see the Afghans punished so severely that no one would ever again dare to challenge the might of Britain. The loss of 16,000 lives was a tragedy, but the humiliation of the empire was an existential threat. The public demanded that the stain be cleansed, and they knew the only cleansing agent the empire truly trusted was fire and steel. Asterisk, asterisk, the British response, when it came, was not a rescue mission, it was an act of wrath. From the ashes of Lord Auckland's failed policy, a new force was forged. Given a name that left no doubt as to its purpose, the Army of Retribution. This was not an army of occupation or diplomacy. Its mission was singular, brutal, and clear, to inflict a terrible and unforgettable punishment upon the people of Afghanistan, to redeem British honor through overwhelming violence, and to secure the release of the hostages. The man chosen to lead it, General George Pollock, was the antithesis of the indecisive Elphinstone. He was a cautious, methodical, and utterly ruthless artilleryman. He did not march with fanfare and confidence. He marched with siege guns and a cold, calculating fury. This new army was a different beast from the one that had perished in the snows. It was larger, better equipped, and stripped of all illusions. The romantic notions of the great game were gone, replaced by a grim, methodical thirst for vengeance. The soldiers, many of whom were new recruits, were fed a steady diet of stories about the massacre, They were shown the last stand at Gandamak as an act of martyrdom, and the death of MacNaughton as a treacherous assassination. They were not marching to civilize. They were marching to avenge their fallen comrades. A dark, hateful energy propelled them forward. Every Afghan was seen as a potential murderer, every village a nest of vipers. The concept of non-combatant was a luxury the army of retribution was not inclined to afford. Their advance back through the passes that had been the graveyard of Elphinstone's force was a systematic and brutal campaign. They did not rush. They moved slowly, deliberately, securing their supply lines and punishing every sign of resistance with overwhelming force. The Khyber Pass, where Ghilzai warriors had once tormented the British, was now stormed and taken by Pollock's men. Villages that were suspected of harboring fighters were surrounded, shelled into rubble by the heavy guns, and then stormed by infantry who were given free rein to kill, loot, and burn. This was not warfare. It was extermination. The British were demonstrating that while their pride could be wounded, their capacity for vengeance was limitless. The psychological shift was absolute. Where Elphinstone's army had been arrogant and complacent, Pollock's was paranoid and vicious. They trusted no one. They saw an enemy behind every rock. The land that had seemed picturesque to the First Army was now seen as a hateful, treacherous wilderness that needed to be tamed with fire. The soldiers fought with a cold rage, their actions fueled by a desire to make the Afghans pay for every single British life lost in the winter retreat. The very landscape seemed to recoil from their advance. The smoke from burning villages became a constant feature on the horizon, a series of dark funeral pyres marking the army's relentless path back towards the city that had dared to defy them. This was the empire striking back, not with the arrogance of a confident ruler, but with the focused, terrifying rage of a wounded beast. The army of retribution moved like a plague across the landscape, leaving a trail of scorched earth and terror in its wake. The concept of a proportional response had no place in their doctrine. Their doctrine was one of terror. Any village that lay along the path of the retreat, any community suspected of having participated in the attacks, was condemned. The process was brutally simple. The army would surround a village, the inhabitants would flee to the hills if they could, and then the artillery would open fire, smashing the mud brick walls into dust. Afterwards, the infantry would move in, not to fight, but to destroy. They set fire to the houses, chopped down the fruit trees in the orchards, and destroyed the vital irrigation channels that allowed life to exist in this arid land. They were not just killing people, they were killing the future, ensuring that nothing could grow again for a generation. This was a war on the land itself. When Pollock's army finally stood before the gates of Kabul in September 1842, the city held its breath. The Afghan forces, now fractured by internal rivalries following their great victory, could not mount a unified defense. Akbar Khan, the architect of the British defeat, had been forced to flee north. The city was surrendered. The British marched in, not with the celebratory music of 1839, but with a grim, ominous silence. The Union Jack was raised once more over the Bala Hissar, a symbolic act of reconquest. The first priority was securing the release of the hostages. Lady Sale, General Shelton, and the other survivors of the retreat, who had been held captive for 9 months, were finally freed. Their reunion with their countrymen was a moment of profound emotion, but it was overshadowed by the dark purpose that still animated the army. The retribution was not yet complete. A debate raged among the British command. What should be the final act of vengeance? Some argued for the complete destruction of the city. General Pollock, wary of getting bogged down in a prolonged occupation, opted for a more symbolic, yet equally devastating, act. He ordered the complete and utter destruction of the Great Bazaar of Kabul, the Shah Shujah. This was not a military target. It was the vibrant commercial and cultural heart of the city, a magnificent covered marketplace that had stood for centuries. It was chosen for a specific reason. It was the place where the dismembered body of Sir William McNaughton had been displayed. The demolition was carried out with methodical, vengeful glee. Soldiers used gunpowder to blow up the beautifully carved wooden arches and intricately tiled domes. They went from stall to stall, smashing the merchants' goods and setting fire to everything that would burn. For 2 days, the Great Bazaar was consumed by a firestorm, the smoke blotting out the sun, creating a dark, apocalyptic twilight over the city. The British soldiers, given license to loot and destroy, ran rampant. They were not just destroying a building, they were attempting to destroy a piece of the Afghan soul, to leave a permanent scar on the city that would serve as a timeless warning. When they were done, the most magnificent bazaar in Central Asia was a smoking, blackened ruin. The honor of the empire, they believed, had been satisfied. While the British were focused on their revenge, a different kind of history was being written in the mountains and villages of Afghanistan. For the British, Wazir Akbar Khan was the villain of the story, a treacherous, bloodthirsty savage who had masterminded a massacre, but in the memory of his own people, he was transformed into something else entirely. He became a legend, a national hero, the man who had humbled the most powerful empire on earth. His name was spoken with reverence in the tea-houses and sung about in the epic poems of the Pashtun bards. He was the sword of the Afghan people, the embodiment of their fierce, unyielding spirit of independence. His victory was not seen as an act of treachery, but as a masterful display of strategic genius. He had used the British arrogance against them. He had lured them into a trap of their own making. He had understood, as the British had not, that in Afghanistan, the terrain, the climate, and the will of the people were more powerful than any army. The killing of MacNaughton, which the British viewed as a craven assassination, was seen by many Afghans as a justifiable act of war, the slaying of an enemy commander who was himself plotting betrayal. In the complex code of Pashtunwali, where revenge is a sacred duty, Akbar Khan had avenged the deposition of his father and the invasion of his homeland. The army of retribution, with its burning of villages and the destruction of the Great Bazaar, did not diminish his status. It enhanced it. Every act of British brutality only served to reinforce the narrative that Akbar Khan had been right. He had fought against a cruel and vengeful enemy, an infidel force that had no respect for Afghan life or culture. The smoking ruins of the bazaar were not a symbol of British power, but a testament to their barbarism. It proved that the resistance had been a righteous one. While the British saw their actions as a restoration of honor, the Afghans saw it as the petulant rage of a bully who had been defeated in a fair fight, and had returned to lash out at the innocent. Akbar Khan himself did not live long to enjoy his heroic status. He died a few years later, likely poisoned by his own jealous relatives in the endless cycle of internal Afghan power struggles. But his death did not tarnish his legend. In fact, it cemented it. He became a martyr, a figure frozen in time at the peak of his glory. He was the young, charismatic prince who had risen from exile to unite the tribes and expel the invaders. He represented a moment of pure, triumphant Afghan nationalism. While the British would remember the First Anglo Afghan War as a story of disaster and revenge, the Afghans would remember it as the story of Akbar Khan, the man who had taught an empire the meaning of fear and had proven to the world that the mountains of Afghanistan would never be conquered. After the smoke cleared over the ruins of the Great Bazaar and the last of the hostages were secured, a cold, hard reality settled upon the British command. They had achieved their revenge. They had demonstrated their capacity for destruction, but they had proved nothing else. The fundamental strategic dilemma remained unchanged. They could take Kabul, they could burn it, but they could not hold it. To stay would be to repeat the same fatal mistake that had led to Elphinstone's disaster. An army of occupation would require a constant bleeding supply line, and it would be surrounded by a populace whose hatred for the British had now been burned into their very souls by the army of retribution. To stay was to invite another massacre. And so, in October 1842, just 1 month after they had marched triumphantly back into the city, the British did the one thing they had sworn they would never do again. They retreated. This time, it was not a panicked flight. It was an orderly, disciplined withdrawal. The army of retribution marched out of Kabul with its guns and its standards intact, its soldiers marching in neat columns, but it was a retreat, nonetheless. They were abandoning the city, abandoning the country, abandoning the entire purpose for which the war had been fought. They left behind a smoking ruin where a bazaar had been, thousands of dead Afghans, and a puppet king, Shah Shujah, who was assassinated shortly after they left. His reign melting away the moment the foreign bayonets that propped him up were gone, as they marched back through the same passes where their comrades had perished. The soldiers were not jubilant. There was a grim, hollow feeling to their victory. They had avenged the dead, but what had it accomplished? They had not made Afghanistan a stable, friendly buffer state. They had turned it into a cauldron of enduring hatred. They had not enhanced British prestige. They had merely demonstrated that the empire was a sore loser, capable of immense cruelty in the face of humiliation. The local tribesmen watched them go, this time from a distance. They did not attack. They had already won the war that mattered. They had made their land so inhospitable, so dangerous, that the most powerful empire on earth had decided it was not worth the price. The second retreat was a quiet admission of utter failure. It was a tacit acknowledgement that the entire Afghan adventure, from the confident invasion in 1839 to the vengeful return in 1842, had been a catastrophic miscalculation. They had sacrificed nearly 20,000 lives, British, Indian, and countless thousands of Afghans, and had achieved absolutely nothing. They had not advanced their strategic interests. They had not won the loyalty of the people. They had not even left behind a government that was friendly to them. They left behind only ghosts, ruins, and a legacy of bitterness that would poison the relationship between the two nations for a century to come. The army of retribution marched home, but they left the victory in the mountains. The last soldier of the army of retribution disappeared back through the Khyber Pass, and a profound quiet settled over Kabul. The city, scarred and brutalized but unbroken, began the slow process of healing. The rubble of the Great Bazaar was gradually cleared away. The rhythms of life, which had been so violently disrupted, slowly returned. The British were gone. Shah Shujah was dead. And Dost Muhammad Khan, the very man the British had spent so much blood and treasure to depose, was eventually released from his exile in India and returned to the throne of Afghanistan. The great game had come full circle, ending exactly where it had begun. It was as if the entire invasion, the massacres, the revenge, had been a furious, bloody, and ultimately pointless dream. Kabul remained. The city, nestled in its high valley, had seen empires come and go. It had watched the Greeks of Alexander the Great march through, their spears glinting in the sun. It had endured the Mongol hordes of Genghis Khan. It had now seen the British, with their red coats and their powerful cannons, arrive with arrogance and leave in failure. The city was a silent witness, its ancient memory far longer than the fleeting ambitions of foreign powers. It understood a truth that the invaders never seemed to grasp, that it could be occupied, but never truly conquered. Its true defense was not its walls, but the fierce, indomitable spirit of the people who lived in the mountains that surrounded it. As the years turned into decades, the story of the British disaster became a cautionary tale, a legend whispered in the courts of other empires, yet the lesson was never truly learned. The strategic lure of Afghanistan, its position as a crossroads of Asia, continued to tempt foreign powers who believed that this time it would be different. They would come with new technologies, new ideologies, and the same old arrogance. In the 20th century, the British would fight a third war there. Later, the Soviets would arrive with their tanks and helicopters. Convinced that their socialist vision could tame this unruly land, they too would leave, broken and defeated. Their mighty army, humbled by the same tactics that had destroyed Elphinstone. And after them, another great power from the West would come, with its drones and its special forces. And it too would learn the hard lesson of the Afghan graveyard. Kabul watched it all. A timeless observer of the cyclical folly of empires. The city saw history not as a line, but as a wheel, constantly turning, bringing new invaders who made the same mistakes, blinded by the same pride. The ghosts of Elphinstone's army seemed to linger in the passes, a permanent warning to those who would seek to impose their will on this land. The city remained, its spirit unconquered, its people resilient, forever watching the horizon for the next army, the next flag, the next lesson that would need to be taught. The names of the invaders changed, but the story remained the same.